Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling chapters of American history. Before we proceed, please share in the comments where you are joining from. Now, let us step together into the shadows of the past. The year is 1911. The Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina stand like silent titans over profound valleys and seemingly boundless dense forests. In this era, the region still clings fiercely to its secrets. The roads are scarcely more than dirt paths, and communities exist in isolation, divided by miles of impenetrable woodland and rugged peaks. The modernity already reshaping the great eastern cities has not yet reached this place. Here in the mountains, time appears to move at a slower pace, where age-old traditions linger like ghosts from bygone days. Elizabeth Ward was 23 years old when her story became entangled with the mystery that would haunt these hills for decades. She was a young woman of plain appearance, with dark hair always secured in a severe bun and eyes that many recalled as nervous. Elizabeth lived on a modest farm near Asheville in Buncombe County with her husband, Thomas Ward, and their 2 children. Existence there was harsh, defined by relentless labor on the land and the daily fight for survival. Thomas worked as a lumberjack, spending long days in the surrounding woods, while Elizabeth managed the household, the children, and a small garden that provided meager sustenance during the toughest winter months. Yet, there was something about Elizabeth that puzzled her nearest neighbors. She was known as a woman of few words, who seldom smiled and seemed to carry a hidden burden. The other local women, gathering at the small Methodist church on Sundays, would whisper about Elizabeth's distant stare, about how she would sometimes stand motionless for extended periods, gazing toward the distant mountains as if anticipating something or someone. Rumors circulated, as they always do in small, remote communities. Some claimed Elizabeth practiced old folk arts, that she communed with spirits on moonless nights. Others suggested she had never truly recovered from the loss of a 3rd child, stillborn 2 years prior. The winter of 1910 to 1911 was exceptionally severe. Snow smothered the mountains to a depth unseen in years, leaving families even more cut off, confined to their properties for weeks on end. It was during this time that the initial signs of the coming tragedy emerged. Thomas Ward mentioned to the owner of the sawmill where he worked that Elizabeth was not well. She was eating very little, spending hours staring out the window, and had begun, he said, talking to herself at night. The man was clearly concerned, but in that time and place, private family matters were handled behind closed doors. There were no specialist doctors nearby, and the notion of seeking external help was met with distrust. In February of 1911, as the snow finally began to thaw and the trails became passable once more, a definitive change occurred at the Ward homestead. The closest neighbors, living roughly 2 miles away, observed that smoke no longer rose from the chimney during the day. This was peculiar, for even with winter waning, temperatures remained low enough to necessitate a constant fire. One neighbor, a man named Jeremiah Foster, decided to pay a visit, bringing some provisions and extra firewood. What he encountered upon arriving at the Ward property would alter everything. The house was utterly silent. No sounds of children at play, no noise of domestic activity. Jeremiah knocked on the door repeatedly, calling for Thomas and Elizabeth. There was no reply. He walked around the property, noting that the snow around the house bore no fresh footprints save his own. The chickens in the small coop were dead, likely from hunger and cold. Something was terribly amiss. With a pounding heart, Jeremiah pushed open the door, which yielded easily. What he saw inside that dark, frigid space made him stagger back immediately, stumbling over his own feet and falling into the snow outside. Thomas Ward was seated in a chair near the cold fireplace, perfectly still. His body was rigid, preserved by a death that had come days or possibly weeks earlier. But that was not the only sight that terrified Jeremiah. The children were there as well, arranged in a manner that seemed almost deliberate, almost intentional, and Elizabeth was nowhere to be found. Jeremiah Foster ran back to his own home on unsteady legs, his heart racing. He needed to alert the authorities, but the nearest police station was in Asheville, over 15 miles away, a long trail still muddy from melting snow. It took nearly an entire day for the Buncombe County Sheriff, a man named William Hawthorne, to assemble a few men and make the trek to the Ward property. When they finally arrived late the following afternoon, the sun was already beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows over the scene they were about to examine. Sheriff Hawthorne was an experienced man, familiar with death in the mountains. Accidents were commonplace in that harsh, unforgiving terrain. People succumbed to cold, hunger, and illnesses treatable in the cities. Yet, when he entered the Ward home and witnessed what Jeremiah had described, even he felt a chill. Thomas Ward remained in the same position, seated as if merely at rest. But his open, glazed eyes told another story. The children, a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, lay in their beds, tucked under blankets, as if someone had carefully prepared them for an eternal slumber. There were no clear signs of violence, no marks of a struggle, no visible blood, no broken items to suggest a confrontation. The house was unnaturally orderly, almost peaceful in its deadly stillness. However, Elizabeth Ward's absence transformed this scene of family tragedy into something far darker and more perplexing. The sheriff and his men commenced a search for clues, moving furniture, opening drawers, and inspecting every room of the small wooden house. It was in one of the bedrooms that they discovered something that would deepen the mystery further. Beneath the bed, shared by Elizabeth and Thomas, was a small wooden chest. Inside, neatly folded, were Elizabeth's clothes, alongside a few personal effects, a wooden comb, a small cracked mirror, and a worn leather-bound journal. Sheriff Hawthorne picked up the journal with careful hands and began to page through it. The leaves contained entries written in a tight, agitated script, some dated months prior. Many of the words were hard to decipher, scrawled in haste, or perhaps in moments of intense emotional distress, but certain sentences leaped from the pages like silent screams. "They won't stop looking at me," stated an entry from December 1910. "Thomas doesn't believe it, but I know they're there in the trees, waiting." Another entry from January 1911 was even more disturbing. "The children have started seeing them too. They wake up in the night and point at the window. I can't protect them anymore. I don't know how." Then, in one of the last legible entries, penned in a handwriting that grew increasingly desperate, was written, "He told me what needs to be done. It's the only way to save them. The cold will take them anyway. Better this way. Better by my hand than by theirs." The sheriff closed the diary slowly, feeling the weight of those words. What had Elizabeth seen, or believed she had seen? Who were they? And most crucially, what exactly had transpired in that house during those long weeks of winter solitude? The answers were not there, but one fact was becoming evident. This was no accident. These deaths had been caused, perhaps even planned, by someone who knew and loved the victims, and that individual had vanished into the vast, merciless Appalachian wilderness. The sheriff's men organized a search party. They needed to locate Elizabeth Ward, not only to comprehend the events, but also because she might be in peril lost in the mountains or injured in some remote spot. The temperatures remained low enough to be fatal at night, and even by day, the higher elevations stayed snow-covered. Search teams were formed with volunteers from nearby communities, men familiar with every trail, valley, and cave in the vicinity. They combed miles of thick forest, calling Elizabeth's name, looking for footprints or any trace of her passage. Days stretched into weeks. The search persisted, but as time elapsed, hope of finding Elizabeth alive dwindled. Some began to speculate that she might have fallen from one of the many cliffs scarring the mountains or fallen victim to wild animals. Others, particularly those privy to excerpts from the diary, harbored darker theories. They whispered that Elizabeth had lost her sanity entirely, that she had committed a horrific act against her family, and then fled to perish alone in the wilderness, consumed by guilt and remorse. Then, nearly 3 weeks after the discovery of the bodies at the Ward home, an event occurred that would dramatically shift the investigation's trajectory. A hunter named Samuel Pritchard, tracking deer on the slopes of Mount Mitchell, the highest peak in the Appalachians east of the Mississippi, noticed something unusual. There stood a small abandoned cabin, an old structure possibly used by hunters or miners decades earlier. Samuel knew of this cabin, having passed it on previous excursions, but this time, smoke curled from its makeshift chimney. Samuel Pritchard approached the cabin warily, his rifle held firmly. It was not unusual to find travelers or itinerant laborers using such abandoned shelters, but something about this situation unsettled him. The cabin was in an exceptionally remote location, at least 15 kilometers from the main trail, on a ridge where the cold remained biting and the snow lay deep. Whoever was inside had deliberately chosen one of the most isolated and inaccessible spots in the entire region. When Samuel drew near enough, he called out, identifying himself as a local hunter. There was no response. The mountain silence absorbed all sound, except the wind sighing through the pines. He edged closer, now noticing that the cabin door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the frigid gusts. Heart pounding, Samuel pushed the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him instinctively jerk back, nearly tripping over a snow-covered root. Elizabeth Ward was there, curled on the dirt floor in a corner of the hut. She was alive, but her appearance was horrifying. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked and discolored. Her clothes were torn and soiled, and her bare feet showed clear signs of frostbite. Yet most disturbing was her expression. She did not seem afraid or startled by Samuel's presence. Instead, she gazed at him with an unnatural calm, as if she had been awaiting his arrival, as if this were all part of some incomprehensible plan. Samuel attempted to speak to her, to ask if she was all right, if she needed assistance. Elizabeth merely shook her head slowly, as if the question held no meaning. She muttered something he could not fully grasp, words that seemed jumbled, devoid of logical connection. Samuel realized he had to act swiftly. He removed his own coat and draped it over Elizabeth's trembling shoulders, then helped her to her feet. She did not resist, but neither did she actively cooperate. She moved like a doll, allowing herself to be guided without any will of her own. The descent from the mountain took hours. Samuel practically had to carry Elizabeth for several stretches, especially when her exhaustion became overwhelming. She would faint for minutes, then awaken and continue walking as if nothing had occurred. Throughout the entire journey, she uttered no coherent words, only mutterings and sentence fragments that made no sense. Samuel began to understand he was not merely bringing back a lost woman. He was retrieving someone who had crossed an invisible boundary, someone who might never fully return. When they finally reached Asheville, it was already night. Samuel took Elizabeth directly to Sheriff Hawthorne's office. The sheriff was simultaneously relieved and dismayed to see her. She was alive, but in what state? The sheriff summoned the local physician, Dr. Henry Calloway, who examined Elizabeth in one of the cells, temporarily used as a makeshift room. The initial diagnosis was bleak: extreme malnutrition, hypothermia, potential permanent damage to her feet from frostbite, and what the doctor termed a state of profound mental disturbance. Yet Sheriff Hawthorne needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened in that isolated mountain home. After Elizabeth received basic medical care, food, and warmth, the sheriff attempted to question her. He sat in a chair beside her bed and, in the gentlest tone he could manage, began to ask. What had happened to Thomas? What had happened to the children? Why had she fled to the mountains? Elizabeth looked at him with those hollow eyes and began to speak. But what emerged from her mouth were not clear answers. It was a confusing tapestry of fragmented memories, delusions, and partial confessions that continually contradicted themselves. She spoke of figures in the trees, of voices calling to her in the night, of a cold that came from within, not from without. She said she had tried to protect her family, that she had done what was necessary, that they were safe now. But when the sheriff pressed for specifics about her actions, Elizabeth would either fall silent or break into uncontrollable weeping. The following days brought more confusion than clarity. Dr. Calloway re-examined Elizabeth and declared she was suffering from what he called melancholic mania, a term used at the time to describe severe mental conditions that today we might recognize as a psychotic break or profound dissociative state. He recommended her transfer to the North Carolina State Hospital for the treatment of mental illness in Raleigh, over 250 miles away. But before that could happen, the sheriff needed to decide whether to formally charge her with the crimes she appeared to have committed. Meanwhile, the bodies of Thomas Ward and the children were examined more thoroughly by a medical examiner from Charlotte. His findings cast even deeper shadows over the case. There were no signs of direct physical violence, but there was evidence of poisoning. Traces of a substance identified as derived from local flora, specifically the roots of water. Hemlock, a highly toxic plant abundant in the region's marshy areas, were detected. This death would have been slow and agonizing, yet its symptoms could easily have been mistaken for a common illness in an environment lacking proper medical oversight. This revelation transformed everything. Elizabeth had not merely allowed her family to perish from cold or neglect. She had deliberately and with premeditation poisoned her husband and her own children. Sheriff Hawthorne was left with no alternative. Elizabeth Ward would be formally charged with 3 counts of murder. News of Elizabeth Ward's arrest spread through the Appalachian communities like wildfire. In a region where everyone knew each other, where families had lived side by side for generations, the notion that a mother could commit such a horrific act was nearly incomprehensible. People gathered in churches, general stores, and the few businesses scattered through the villages, discussing the case in hushed, fearful tones. Some defended Elizabeth, arguing she must have been possessed by something evil, that no woman in her right mind could be capable of such an act. Others were less merciful, calling her a monster, a witch, and demanding swift and severe justice. The trial was scheduled for May 1911 at the Buncombe County Courthouse in Asheville. In the months leading up to the trial, Elizabeth Ward remained in a special cell, isolated from other prisoners. She was under constant watch, having twice attempted to take her own life. The first time, she tried to hang herself using strips torn from her dress. The second time, she tried to open her wrists with a piece of metal pried from the bed frame. Each attempt deepened the understanding that Elizabeth Ward was truly lost in a world of torment and guilt from which she might never return. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a young, ambitious man named Robert Ashford, who viewed this high-profile trial as an opportunity to establish his reputation statewide. He spent weeks preparing his case, collecting statements from neighbors, assembling physical evidence, and constructing a narrative that portrayed Elizabeth as a cold, calculating killer who had meticulously planned the extermination of her own family. Ashford would argue that the diary entries, initially seen as signs of insanity, were actually evidence of premeditation, demonstrating that Elizabeth had contemplated her actions for weeks before carrying them out. Elizabeth's defense was handled by a local attorney named Marcus Flynn, a man in his 50s who had defended numerous difficult cases throughout his career. Flynn knew he faced a nearly impossible battle. The evidence against Elizabeth was overwhelming, and public sentiment was heavily stacked against her. His only hope was to plead insanity, to prove that Elizabeth was so mentally disturbed at the time of the crimes that she could not be held legally responsible for her actions. It was a risky strategy, for even if it succeeded, Elizabeth would likely spend the rest of her life confined to a mental institution, a fate many considered worse than death. When the trial day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. People who had traveled from across the county filled the benches, while others crowded outside, awaiting any news. The presiding judge was Abraham Patterson, a stern and respected man who had served on the bench for over 20 years. He opened the session with a lengthy speech about the gravity of the case and the need for order and decorum during the proceedings. Elizabeth was escorted into the courtroom by 2 guards. Her appearance shocked many in attendance. She had lost even more weight during her detention, and her hair, once dark and thick, was now cut short and showed premature streaks of gray. She wore a simple gray dress, and her hands were chained in front of her. As she sat beside her lawyer, she did not look at the crowd or make eye contact with anyone. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point, as if she were seeing something no one else could see. Prosecutor Ashford presented his case with surgical precision. He called witness after witness. Jeremiah Foster described in disturbing detail the scene he had encountered at the Ward home. The medical examiner explained technically how the poisoning had occurred, how long the victims had suffered before dying, and how the symptoms had manifested. Samuel Pritchard recounted his encounter with Elizabeth in the remote cabin, her seemingly unnatural calm, and her incomprehensible mutterings. But it was when Ashford presented Elizabeth's diary that the emotional impact truly struck the room. He read selected excerpts aloud, placing particular emphasis on passages that suggested planning and intent. When he read the phrase, "better by my hand than by theirs," a murmur of horror swept through the crowd. Ashford argued that these words showed Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing, that she had made a conscious, if disturbed, choice to take her family's lives. Defense attorney Marcus Flynn faced a nearly impossible task. During his presentation, he called Dr. Calloway to testify about Elizabeth's mental state. The doctor explained that she suffered from severe delusions, that she saw and heard things that were not there, and that she had completely lost touch with reality. Flynn argued that the same diary passages the prosecutor used as evidence of premeditation were actually evidence of insanity. Elizabeth was not planning a crime. She was responding to a distorted reality created by her diseased mind. Flynn also attempted to provide context for Elizabeth's life before the tragedy. He called neighbors who testified to the hardships the family faced, the brutal winter isolation, and the earlier death of their 3rd child, which had left Elizabeth visibly changed. He painted a picture of a woman slowly broken by the unforgiving circumstances of her life, who had reached a mental breaking point where she could no longer distinguish between protection and destruction. But Ashford countered each argument forcefully. During his cross-examination, he questioned Dr. Calloway about the limits of contemporary medical knowledge regarding mental illness. Could they truly say with certainty that Elizabeth did not know what she was doing? Did delusions and insanity completely preclude the ability to plan and execute? He reminded the jury that Elizabeth had managed to hide in the mountains for weeks, had survived extreme conditions, and had demonstrated a capacity for strategic thinking that seemed incompatible with a complete loss of reason. The trial lasted 6 full days. At the end, the moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading arrived: Elizabeth Ward's own testimony. Marcus Flynn had debated for days about whether to put Elizabeth on the witness stand, It was a tremendous risk. Her mental state was unstable, unpredictable. She might say something that would completely destroy any chance of an insanity defense. But Flynn also knew the jury needed to see her, hear her, understand that they were not facing a calculating monster, but a deeply troubled woman. On the morning of the 6th day, he made his decision. Elizabeth was led to the witness stand by the guards. She moved slowly, as if each step required immense effort. When she finally sat down, her still chained hands rested in her lap, and she looked at her lawyer with an expression that seemed both empty and desperate. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even those who had spoken in hushed tones throughout the trial now held their breath, waiting to hear what the accused would say. Flynn began with simple, gentle questions. He asked her to state her full name, her age, and where she was born. Elizabeth responded in such a low voice that Judge Patterson had to ask her to speak louder. She repeated her answers, but her voice remained weak, filled with a seemingly bottomless sadness. Flynn then began to guide her through her story, from her childhood on a small farm in Madison County, her marriage to Thomas at 18, the birth of her children, and her life in the mountains. For a moment, Elizabeth seemed almost normal, responding coherently and directly. But when Flynn began asking about the months leading up to the tragedy, something changed in her eyes. She became visibly agitated. Her hands began to tremble, and her breathing grew irregular. Flynn asked about the diary, about the notes she had made. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. "I saw them," she said, her voice a little stronger now, but filled with a disturbing conviction. Every night, figures among the trees, waiting, watching. Thomas said it was my imagination, the exhaustion, the cold, the darkness of the mountains. But I knew they were real. I could feel their eyes on me, on the children. They wanted something. They wanted to take my babies. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, calling for silence. Flynn continued, asking Elizabeth to explain what she meant by figures. Who were they? Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked directly at the jury for the first time, and what the jurors saw in that gaze made them recoil involuntarily. There was terror there, but also something else, something that seemed almost religious in its intensity. They were the ones who live in the mountains, she said, the ancient ones. My grandmother used to talk about them when I was a child. She said these mountains were inhabited long before we arrived, that there were things here that weren't human, that weren't animals, things that watched and waited. I never believed it until that winter, until I started actually seeing them. Flynn knew this was not helping his case, but he needed to let Elizabeth speak. He needed the jury to see how deeply disturbed she was. He asked what these figures had said to her, what they had done. Elizabeth began speaking faster now, the words tumbling out in a torrent that was hard to follow. They didn't speak with words, she explained. But I understood. They showed me visions. They showed my children being taken, dragged into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. They showed Thomas frozen, abandoned. They told me that winter would never end, that we would be trapped there forever, that eventually the cold and hunger would take us anyway. And then a voice that seemed to come from inside my own head, told me there was a way to protect them, a way to make sure they wouldn't suffer. Prosecutor Ashford rose to object, but Judge Patterson motioned for him to sit. He wanted to hear everything Elizabeth had to say. Flynn then asked the crucial question. Elizabeth, did you know what you were doing when you put those roots in your family's food? Elizabeth looked at him with tears streaming down her face. I knew I was saving them, she whispered. I knew I was keeping them safe. The voice told me that if I did this, if I freed them before the ancients could take them, their souls would be protected. They wouldn't feel pain. They would sleep and wake in a better place, away from the cold, away from the figures in the trees. I loved them. I just wanted to protect them. The courtroom erupted in voices. Some shouted in anger, others in compassion. Women wept openly. Judge Patterson banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. Elizabeth had collapsed on the witness stand, sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body shaking. Guards had to carry her back to her place beside her lawyer. Prosecutor Ashford knew he had his chance. When it was his turn to question Elizabeth, he was relentless. He confronted her with every detail of the crime. He asked how she had collected the poisonous roots, how she had prepared the food, how she had watched her family eat, knowing what would happen. He asked why, if she truly believed her visions, she had not simply taken everyone away, had not sought help, had not done literally anything other than kill. Elizabeth tried to respond, but her answers grew increasingly incoherent. She kept returning to the figures in the trees, the voice in her head, the absolute terror that had consumed her thoughts. Ashford pressed further, asking why she had fled afterward. If she truly believed she was protecting her family, why had she left the bodies behind and hidden in the mountains? Because after I finished, Elizabeth said, in a voice so low it could barely be heard, I realized the voice had lied, that the figures had never been real, that I had killed my family for nothing, and I couldn't live with that. I went to the mountains to die, too. Elizabeth's testimony left the courtroom in a collective state of shock. When the guards led her back to her cell after hours of brutal interrogation, many in the audience still sat, processing what they had just witnessed. There was no clarity here, only layers upon layers of tragedy and madness that seemed to deepen the more one tried to comprehend them. Prosecutor Ashford had managed to extract disturbing details from her about how she had collected hemlock roots from the banks of a nearby stream, how she had boiled and ground them into a paste that she mixed into the family stew. But even these technical details, which should have painted a picture of calculated premeditation, were presented by Elizabeth in a manner so disconnected from reality that it was impossible not to question her sanity. Closing arguments began the next morning. Marcus Flynn stood before the jury, composed of 12 local men, all family men, all familiar with the hardships of mountain life. He spoke for over 2 hours, meticulously constructing a portrait of Elizabeth as a victim of her own broken mind. Flynn highlighted every detail of her life that could explain, even if it did not justify, what had happened. The death of their third child, which had occurred under traumatic circumstances during a difficult birth in which Elizabeth also nearly lost her life. The increasing isolation during that particularly harsh winter when the family went more than 5 weeks without seeing another human being. The extreme deprivation, the gnawing hunger, the bone-piercing cold, the constant darkness that turned days into endless nights. Flynn argued that Elizabeth had suffered what he called a complete mental breakdown, a break with reality so profound that she genuinely believed she was protecting her family from imagined dangers. He cited similar cases he had researched, situations in other parts of the country where mothers under extreme stress had committed horrific acts while trapped in psychotic states. He implored the jury to consider not only the act itself, but the circumstances leading up to it, the defendant's mental state, and the complete absence of any rational motive or personal gain. When Robert Ashford took the stand to present his closing argument, he took a different approach. He acknowledged that Elizabeth had suffered, that she had lived in difficult conditions, that she possibly had mental problems, but he insisted that this did not absolve her of responsibility. Ashford reminded the jury that hundreds, perhaps thousands of families lived in similar conditions in those same mountains. They faced the same brutal winters, the same isolation, the same deprivations. Yet, they did not kill their children. They did not poison their husbands. Ashford argued that accepting insanity as a defense in this case would set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that anyone under sufficient stress could commit the most heinous crimes and escape justice. The prosecutor then went on to describe in devastating detail the suffering of the victims. Thomas Ward, who had worked hard all his life to provide for his family, who trusted his wife completely, who likely died without understanding why his body was failing. The innocent children, a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, who were blameless, who depended on their mother for protection and received only death from her. Ashford reminded the jury that these victims deserved justice, that their lives had value, that they could not be forgotten amidst compassion for the accused. The jury retired for deliberation late that afternoon. The hours dragged on like days. Outside the courthouse, groups formed and argued heatedly over what the verdict should be. Some demanded a full conviction, insisting that allowing Elizabeth to escape the maximum penalty would dishonor the victim's memory. Others, particularly women from the area who intimately understood the hardships of raising children in such a hostile environment, expressed sympathy for Elizabeth, suggesting that any mother could break under sufficient pressure. Inside the deliberation room, the jury faced an equally divisive debate. Certain members were convinced from the start that Elizabeth was guilty of premeditated murder and should face the law's full consequence. Others argued fervently for the insanity defense, maintaining that no sane person would commit such acts against their own family. The argument stretched into the night, then into the next day, and then into another night. Judge Patterson considered declaring a hung jury, but decided to grant them more time. Finally, after nearly 48 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom quickly filled again. Elizabeth was brought in, appearing even more frail and detached than before. She no longer wept, no longer visibly reacted to her surroundings. She seemed to have retreated to some deep internal refuge, a place where the outside world could no longer touch her. The jury foreman, an elderly farmer named Jonathan Weaver, stood when asked. His voice trembled slightly as he announced the verdict. Elizabeth Ward had been found guilty of 3 counts of murder. However, the jury had added a special recommendation, asking the judge to consider the defendant's mental instability during sentencing and suggesting confinement in a mental institution rather than execution. Judge Patterson received the verdict in silence, studying the document for several minutes before speaking. He thanked the jury for their service and set formal sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time to carefully consider the recommendation and all legal options. Elizabeth was led back to her cell without showing any reaction, as if the words held no meaning, as if she were already beyond the reach of human justice. The 2 weeks leading to sentencing were marked by intense regional debate. Newspapers in Asheville, Charlotte, and even Raleigh published articles about the case, each offering its perspective on what should happen to Elizabeth Ward. Some editorialists argued execution was the only appropriate response to such monstrous crimes. Others wrote lengthy essays on the need for compassion, on how society had failed women like Elizabeth, leaving them isolated and without resources until something shattered beyond repair. When sentencing day finally arrived, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Abraham Patterson had spent the previous 2 weeks immersing himself in legal precedent, consulting other judges, speaking with medical experts, and even community religious leaders. He knew this was no ordinary case, and his decision would resonate far beyond Buncombe County. Patterson was known for his severity, but also for his meticulous sense of justice. He deeply believed in the rule of law, but also recognized it needed to be applied with wisdom, not mere inflexibility. Elizabeth was brought into the courtroom for the last time. She had lost even more weight during the weeks of waiting, her face taking on the appearance of a skull covered in thin, pale skin. Her eyes, which had once shown a glimmer of life, now seemed completely vacant. The guards practically had to hold her up as she was led to her seat. Marcus Flynn was at her side, but even he seemed to have lost hope of reaching her in any meaningful way. She was physically present, but her mind seemed to have journeyed to some distant and irreversible place. Judge Patterson began his statement by methodically reviewing the facts presented at trial. He discussed the discovery of the bodies, the evidence of poisoning, and Elizabeth's own disturbing testimony. He acknowledged the case's complexity, the difficulty of reconciling the heinous crimes with the defendant's obvious mental disturbance. Patterson then addressed the issue of criminal responsibility and insanity, explaining the limitations of 1911 North Carolina law in dealing with cases where mental illness was evident, but premeditation was also established. The judge spoke for nearly an hour before finally pronouncing the sentence. He announced that, while the jury had found Elizabeth guilty of murder, he was inclined to accept the recommendation for clemency based on her mental condition. However, Patterson made it clear this did not mean Elizabeth would be released or the crimes minimized. 3 innocent lives had been taken, and society demanded justice and protection. The final sentence was delivered in a grave, solemn voice. Elizabeth Ward would be confined indefinitely at the North Carolina State Hospital in Raleigh, in the ward designated for patients deemed criminally insane. She would remain there for the rest of her life, unless attending physicians determined at some unlikely future point that she had fully recovered her sanity and no longer posed a danger. Patterson emphasized this confinement was no less a punishment than imprisonment or execution. In many ways a slow death sentence, a lifetime spent forever separated from society. Elizabeth showed no reaction when the sentence was pronounced. She remained seated, staring at some invisible point ahead, her hands motionless in her lap. When the guards came to take her away, she rose mechanically and allowed herself to be led from the room. It was the last time most in the courtroom would see her. She was transported to Raleigh in a closed carriage, accompanied by guards and a hospital representative. The journey took almost a week. The roads were poor, especially through the mountains, requiring frequent stops. Throughout, Elizabeth barely spoke. She ate and drank automatically, as if her body followed basic survival instructions, while her mind was entirely absent. The guards were disturbed by her silent, spectral presence. One later described it as like escorting a living ghost. The North Carolina State Hospital was an imposing, somber structure of dark red brick surrounded by high walls. Established decades earlier to house those society deemed mentally ill or dangerous, conditions were notoriously harsh even for the time. Patients were often kept in cramped cells, received minimal medical treatment, and were subjected to therapies now recognized as cruel and ineffective. But in 1911, this was considered a fitting fate for people like Elizabeth Ward. She was registered upon admission as patient number 347. Her personal belongings, only the clothes she wore and a small wooden crucifix that had belonged to her mother, were confiscated and filed away. She was taken to the maximum security ward, where the most dangerous or unstable patients were kept. Her cell measured approximately 3 meters by 3 meters and contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a bucket, and a small barred window offering a limited view of the hospital courtyard. Elizabeth's first months in the hospital were documented in the institution's medical records. The attending physician, Dr. William Thornton, kept regular notes on her behavior and condition. His observations painted a consistent picture of a woman who had almost completely withdrawn from the world. Elizabeth rarely spoke, even when questioned directly. She spent most of her time sitting on her bed, staring at the wall or out the window. She refused to participate in any activities, showed no interest in interacting with other inmates, and passively resisted attempts to engage her in conversation or therapy. Dr. Thornton tried several approaches to reach her. He spoke to her about her life before the tragedy, her childhood, anything that might spark a connection. But Elizabeth remained largely unresponsive. On the rare occasions she spoke, her words were fragmented and confused, often returning to the same obsessive themes: the figures in the trees, the cold, the voices that had guided her to that terrible act. She never expressed explicit remorse, but neither did she try to justify her actions. It was as if those events had happened in another life to another person, and she was merely a distant observer of her own story. The years passed slowly within the hospital walls. Elizabeth aged prematurely. Her hair turned completely white before she turned 30, her body wasting away despite regular meals. It was as if she were gradually fading, consumed from within by some invisible force. Doctors who examined her periodically noted she seemed to suffer from a type of decline they could not fully explain with the medical knowledge of the time. She had no identifiable physical ailment, yet she was clearly dying in a slow and inexorable way. North Carolina State Hospital records show Elizabeth Ward lived there for nearly 7 years after her admission. During that time, she became a near-legendary figure among the staff and fellow patients. There was something about her that disturbed even those accustomed to severe mental illness. Nurses reported an unexplainable chill upon entering her cell, even in summer. Some claimed to hear whispers from her room at night, though Elizabeth rarely spoke aloud. Others swore they sometimes found her awake in the early hours, sitting up in bed with her eyes fixed on the window, murmuring indistinguishable names. Dr. Thornton continued his meticulous notes throughout this period, documenting every small change in her behavior, every brief moment of lucidity, every relapse into profound confusion. In a detailed entry from September 1913, he wrote about an unusual conversation. Elizabeth had awakened from a restless sleep and, for the first time in months, spoke relatively coherently. Thornton asked if she remembered her family, if she thought about them. Elizabeth looked at him with momentary clarity and replied that she thought about them every day, that she saw their faces constantly, that she could hear them calling from the depths of some place she could not reach. This conversation led Thornton to question his previous conclusions. Could it be that Elizabeth was not simply insane, but trapped in a psychological torment that transcended available medical categories? He began researching similar cases in European literature, seeking to understand what we would now call a psychotic disorder with severe depressive features. But the tools and knowledge of 1913 were terribly limited. There were no effective medications, no proven therapies. All Thornton could do was observe, document, and attempt to provide minimal comfort within the institution's confines. As Elizabeth slowly withered away in Raleigh, her story continued to reverberate in the North Carolina mountains. The property where the tragedy occurred remained abandoned for years. No one wanted to buy or even approach the site. Rumors began to circulate about strange phenomena. Hunters reported feeling an oppressive presence near the empty house. Some claimed to see lights moving in the windows at night, though there was no electricity. Others spoke of disturbing sounds, screams that could have been the wind or something more sinister. Jeremiah Foster, the neighbor who discovered the bodies, never fully recovered. He developed a drinking problem and spent his later years retelling the story, always emphasizing the same details: the unnatural stillness of the house, the expressions on the victims' frozen faces, the sense that something was deeply wrong with the place beyond the obvious crimes. Foster died in 1915, just 4 years after the events, under circumstances some considered suspicious, though the local doctor attributed his death to complications from cirrhosis of the liver. Samuel Pritchard, the hunter who found Elizabeth in the remote cabin, also carried the weight of that experience. He rarely spoke of it, but when he did, he always mentioned her eyes, that empty stare that seemed to see right through him to something beyond. Pritchard eventually left the region, moving to Tennessee to rebuild his life away from the haunting memories of the Appalachian Mountains. At the hospital in Raleigh, as 1917 approached, it became clear Elizabeth would not survive much longer. Her body had become little more than skin and bones. She rarely got out of bed, needed to be fed, and spent most of her time in a semi-conscious state. Dr. Thornton, who had become strangely attached to the case, visited her daily, even when his duties did not require it. On a cold November morning in 1917, a nurse named Margaret Sullivan found Elizabeth awake and sitting up in bed, something she had not done in months. Even more surprising, Elizabeth was speaking. Her words were soft but audible, and for the first time in years, they seemed to form complete, coherent thoughts. Margaret ran to get Dr. Thornton, who arrived quickly and began frantically taking notes. Elizabeth spoke of her childhood in the mountains, of how she had loved Thomas when they married, of the joy she felt holding each of her children for the first time. She spoke of the fear that had grown within her during that last winter, of how loneliness and despair had transformed into something darker and more all-consuming. She admitted that perhaps she had never truly seen the figures in the trees, that perhaps her diseased mind had created those visions to justify thoughts already present. She said she had lived all these years in a limbo between life and death, unable to forgive herself, but also unable to simply die and end the suffering. Thornton asked if she regretted it. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment before answering. She said regret was too small a word for what she felt, that there was a chasm inside her where her soul should be, that every breath was a reminder of what she had done. She said she saw her children in dreams, not as they had died, but as they would have grown up. She saw the boy becoming a man, the girl getting married, the grandchildren who would never be. She said Thomas visited her too, not with anger, but with an infinite sadness that was worse than any accusation. This conversation, so lucid and devastating in its honesty, would be Elizabeth's last. Over the next few hours, she gradually returned to her semi-conscious state. But this time, there was a difference. It was as if, by finally expressing everything she had kept bottled inside for so many years, she had allowed herself to release the last thread holding her to life. Elizabeth Ward died 3 days after that final conversation with Dr. Thornton in the early morning hours of November 23, 1917. The nurse who found her reported that she seemed at peace for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Her face, which for years had carried an expression of perpetual torment, was relaxed, almost serene. Her hands, which often twitched even in sleep, rested peacefully on her chest. It was as if, after years of battling demons both internal and external, she had finally found a kind of rest. Dr. Thornton personally performed the post-mortem examination, an unusual practice for a physician of his standing, but he felt a peculiar obligation to see the case through to its absolute conclusion. The examination revealed no specific cause of death. Her organs, though weakened by years of self-inflicted bodily neglect, showed no signs of terminal illness. Her heart had simply stopped beating, as if her body had decided it had lasted long enough. Thornton wrote in his final report that Elizabeth Ward had died of what he called vital exhaustion, a vague term that reflected more the inadequacy of medicine at the time than any real understanding of what had happened. The question of where to bury Elizabeth became unexpectedly complicated. There was no family to claim her body. Her parents had died years before, and she had no living siblings. Thomas Ward's family naturally refused any association with her. The small community near where she had lived made it clear they did not want her back, even in death. The Methodist churchyard, where she had occasionally attended services, denied permission for her burial in consecrated ground, citing the nature of her crimes and the fact that she had never been officially exonerated by religious authority. Eventually, it was decided that Elizabeth would be buried in the hospital's own cemetery, a small plot of land at the back of the property, where patients without families or resources were laid to rest. It was a bleak and unkempt place, with simple numbered headstones instead of names. Elizabeth Ward became number 347, the same number she had borne as a patient. No service was held. Dr. Thornton attended along with 2 nurses who had cared for her during her final days. They stood in silence as the simple pine coffin was lowered into the cold November earth. But Elizabeth's death did not end her story. If anything, it seemed to open a new chapter in a book no one really wanted to continue reading. In the weeks following her burial, hospital staff began reporting disturbing experiences. The cell Elizabeth had occupied became the source of constant reports of unexplained phenomena. Nurses refused to enter it alone, claiming to feel an oppressive presence. Some swore they heard soft cries coming from the empty room. Others reported feeling invisible hands touching them as they passed the door. The hospital administration, concerned about staff morale and growing reluctance to work in that wing, decided to discontinue the cell altogether. It was locked and remained empty, becoming a sort of unofficial memorial to something no one wanted to remember, but also could not forget. Patients in nearby cells reported disturbing dreams, visions of a thin, pale woman wandering the halls at night, searching for something she could never find. Back in the Appalachian Mountains, the property where the original tragedy had occurred remained abandoned. The house had begun to crumble under the weight of time and neglect. The roof had caved in several places, the windows were broken, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the surrounding land. But rumors about the place intensified after Elizabeth's death. Travelers passing through the area at night reported seeing lights moving through the broken windows of the ruined house. Some claimed to hear voices, whispered conversations in tones they could not distinguish, but which filled their hearts with inexplicable dread. A particularly disturbing incident occurred in the winter of 1919, almost 2 years after Elizabeth's death. A group of local youths, intoxicated by liquid courage and morbid curiosity, decided to spend a night in the abandoned house as a sort of dare. 3 young men entered the property at dusk, armed with flashlights and a youthful confidence that would soon be tested. What exactly happened inside the house that night was never fully understood, as the 3 young men ran out before midnight, pale and trembling, refusing to talk about what they had experienced. One of them, however, eventually broke his silence weeks later. He described feeling an unnatural chill that penetrated his clothes, no matter where they were in the house. He spoke of shadows moving in ways that didn't correspond to any light source. Most disturbingly, he swore he clearly heard a woman's voice calling out names, the same names as the ward. Children over and over, in a tone that mixed love and desperation in a way that left him with nightmares for months. Elizabeth Ward's story gradually became a local legend. Parents used it to frighten disobedient children, telling increasingly distorted versions of the real events. Some portrayed Elizabeth as some sort of malevolent witch who had sold her soul for dark power. Others painted her as a tragic victim of forces beyond her comprehension. The truth, as is often the case, was lost somewhere between the extremes, buried beneath layers of speculation and embellishment. Dr. Thornton, who had so meticulously documented Elizabeth's case during his years at the hospital, never published his findings. He kept his files private, locked in a cabinet in his office. Some colleagues speculated that he had developed an unhealthy fixation on the case, that he had become too emotionally invested in a patient who could never be saved. Thornton retired from the hospital in 1922 and spent his final years in relative isolation, dying in 1930 without ever speaking publicly about Elizabeth Ward. His files were eventually donated to the University of North Carolina Medical Library, where they remained largely ignored for decades. It wasn't until the 1960s that a researcher studying the history of mental health treatment in North Carolina discovered the documents and began to piece together the full story. Even then, many details remained obscure, lost to time, or deliberately omitted from official records. Years turned into decades, and Elizabeth Ward's story slowly faded from North Carolina's collective memory. The house where the crimes had occurred finally collapsed completely during a severe storm in 1943. The land was eventually purchased by a developer in the 1950s who built a small summer home on it, never knowing what had happened there decades earlier. The new structure remained standing without incident, suggesting that perhaps the ghosts that had haunted the place had finally found rest, or simply that they had never existed outside the imaginations of people frightened by the tragedy. The North Carolina State Hospital Cemetery underwent several renovations throughout the 20th century. During one renovation in the 1970s, many of the numbered headstones were replaced with more dignified markers that included the names of the deceased when those names could be retrieved from the archives. Elizabeth Ward's grave received a small, simple bronze plaque with her name, birth, and death dates, and nothing else. There was no epitaph, no mention of family, no reference to the events that had brought her to this place. It was as if, even in death, her story was considered too weighty to be inscribed in stone. Dr. Thornton's files, when finally seriously studied in the 1960s and 1970s, provided modern researchers with a fascinating glimpse into how mental illness was understood and treated in the early 20th century. Contemporary psychiatrists who examined Thornton's notes agreed that Elizabeth likely suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe postpartum psychosis, possibly compounded by major depression and extreme isolation. The conditions in which she lived, the trauma of the previous loss of a child, the stress of poverty and isolation, all of these would have created a perfect environment for complete mental breakdown. But clinically understanding what happened to Elizabeth Ward does not make her story any less devastating. 3 innocent lives were brutally and senselessly taken. Thomas Ward, who worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide for his family, never had the chance to grow old or see his children grow up. The 5-year-old boy, whose name was David, never learned to read or discovered what dreams he wanted to pursue. The 3-year-old girl named Sarah never had the opportunity to experience her first day of school, her first love, or any of the thousands of small joys and sorrows that make up a human life. And Elizabeth herself, no matter how much we try to understand her mental state, bore the responsibility for these deaths. She lived her final years in torment, caught between the madness that had driven her actions and moments of terrifying lucidity, where she had to confront what she had done. There is no easy redemption in this story, no neat lesson we can draw. There is only the grim reminder of how human frailty, when pushed beyond its limits by unforgiving circumstances, can manifest in unimaginable tragedy. The Appalachian Mountains region has changed dramatically since 1911. Paved roads now cut through the mountains, where once there were only dirt trails. Cities grew, electricity arrived, hospitals and schools were built. The kind of brutal isolation the Ward family experienced that terrible winter is now almost impossible to imagine for those who live in the same area. But the mountains still hold their secrets. There are still remote places where the silence is absolute, where the trees stand like ancient sentinels, where it's easy to imagine how solitude could transform into something darker. Occasionally, local historians or true crime enthusiasts visit the Buncombe County Archives to read the documents from Elizabeth Ward's trial. Some make pilgrimages to the old hospital cemetery in Raleigh to see her simple headstone. Most emerge from these experiences in thoughtful silence, carrying with them the memory of a story that defies easy categorization. Elizabeth was not simply a malevolent villain, but neither can she be seen solely as a victim. She existed, like all of us, somewhere in between, capable of both profound love and terrible destruction. What remains after all these decades is a haunting reminder of the complexity of the human condition. The mind can break under enough pressure. Love can twist into something unrecognizable. Protection can turn to destruction. And sometimes there are no satisfying answers, no clean closure. Only the silent weight of a tragedy that echoes through time, reminding us of our own fragility and the fine line that separates sanity from madness, care from cruelty, life from death. The horrifying story of Elizabeth Ward remains one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history, a grim reminder that the greatest horrors often come not from without, but from within, from broken minds and shattered hearts that can no longer bear the weight of the world. If you have made it this far on this journey with us, through this dark and disturbing case, thank you for your attention. Stories like this remind us of the importance of understanding not only the crimes themselves, but the complex human circumstances that sometimes lead to them.